You're playing with fire, Alicia. If Carol finds out, you'll lose everything. Katie's voice had a nervous edge to it as she leaned forward in her chair. The kitchen was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock, but the tension in the air was thick. Alicia, casually sipping her wine, smirked and leaned back against the counter, clearly unbothered. That loser won't find out, Alicia said, waving her hand dismissively. Carol is too wrapped up in his work to notice anything. We barely even talk these days. She took another sip of her wine, her eyes shining with something between confidence and carelessness. Katie frowned, her fingers playing nervously with the rim of her coffee mug. She studied Alicia's face, trying to gauge whether she truly understood the risk she was taking or if she was simply blinded by the thrill of the affair. I don't know, Alicia. You think you're being careful, but secrets like these always have a way of coming out. And Carol, he's not the type to just let this slide. He's a calm guy, but everyone has their limits. Alicia rolled her eyes. Katie, you're overthinking this. I've got everything under control. I know what I'm doing. She smiled to herself, clearly enjoying the dangerous dance she was in. Besides, Frank is worth it. He's nothing like Carol. He's exciting. Her voice softened when she spoke about Frank, her lover. Katie shook her head slowly, glancing at the kitchen window where the late afternoon light was starting to fade. She had seen Alicia's marriage slowly disintegrating over the years. It wasn't that Carol was a bad husband. He provided for Alicia, was stable and dependable, but that was exactly the problem. Stability had turned to monotony. The excitement Alicia once felt in her marriage had vanished, replaced by dull routines and quiet resentment. I get it, Alicia. I really do, Katie said after a moment. Carol doesn't give you what you need anymore. But you're playing a dangerous game here. Dangerous? Please, Alicia scoffed. Carol wouldn't hurt a fly. And besides, if he does find out, then maybe it'll finally push him to leave. I wouldn't mind getting out of this marriage. Katie stared at her, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. Do you hear yourself right now? You're talking about blowing up your entire life, your marriage, your home, as if it's nothing. Alicia shrugged. Maybe that's because it is nothing. I'm bored, Katie. I'm tired of pretending. Carol and I haven't been happy in years. This affair with Frank, it's the first thing that's made me feel alive in a long time. Katie leaned forward, her eyes hardening. And what about Frank? Do you really think this is going anywhere with him? What happens when the excitement fades with him too? Alicia paused, swirling her wine glass absent-mindedly. I don't know, she said finally, her voice quieter. I guess I'll figure that out when it happens. The silence that followed was heavy. Katie could feel the distance growing between them. The friend she once knew slipping away into a world of reckless choices and dangerous desires. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Alicia was walking into something far darker than she realized. Alicia, Katie said carefully, just promise me you'll be careful. Men like Carol, they might seem calm, but if you push them too far, there's no telling what they'll do. Alicia chuckled softly, but there was a slight tension in her voice now. I'm not scared of Carol, Katie. He's not going to do anything. If he finds out, he'll be upset, sure, but he'll move on. He's not some crazy person who's going to lose it. Katie stood up, setting her mug down with a soft clink. I hope you're right, she said, grabbing her jacket from the back of the chair. But just think about what you're risking. Affairs never end well. I've thought about it, Alicia said, walking her to the door. And I'm ready for whatever happens. As Katie stepped outside, the cool evening air hit her, and she hesitated for a moment. She turned back to Alicia, her expression serious. If you're not careful, this whole thing could come crashing down around you. Alicia smiled again, that same confident smirk. I got this, Katie. Trust me. After Katie left, Alicia wandered back into the kitchen, feeling the buzz of the wine settle into her limbs. She set the glass down and reached for her phone, her fingers instinctively opening the messaging app. Frank's name lit up on the screen, and she felt a rush of excitement just seeing his face in the little profile picture. She typed quickly, her heart racing just a little as she sent the message. Thinking about you. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Almost immediately, the 3 dots appeared, showing he was typing back. I miss you. Can't wait either. Same time, same place. You know it, she typed back with a grin. There was something intoxicating about their secret meetings. The sneaking around, the thrill of getting away with it. It was the kind of rush she hadn't felt in years. But as she leaned back against the counter, her smile faded slightly. Katie's Wunsch echoed in her mind. Could Carol really find out? She had been careful. She made sure there were no obvious signs. But then again, Carol wasn't a fool. If he had any idea, he was smart enough to dig deeper. Shaking her head, Alicia dismissed the thought. She wasn't going to let fear ruin this for her. Carol might be suspicious, but as long as she kept her story straight, she could continue living this double life. She poured herself another glass of wine and walked to the living room, sinking into the couch. The house was quiet, almost eerily so. Carol wouldn't be home for another few hours, caught up in another late meeting or business dinner. She wondered if he even noticed how distant they'd become, or if he was just as relieved to have the space between them. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Frank. I've been thinking, maybe we should spend a whole weekend together. Just the two of us. Get away from everything for a bit. Alicia's heart skipped a beat. A weekend away? That was risky. It would be harder to hide, but the thought of being alone with him, away from the confines of her failing marriage, was tempting. She bit her lip, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. But before she could respond, she heard the faint sound of the garage door opening. Carol was home. Quickly, she put her phone down, turning the screen face down on the coffee table, and grabbed the TV remote. By the time Carol walked in, she was casually flipping through channels, looking up with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Hey, you're home early, she said, trying to sound casual. Yeah, meeting ended early, Carol replied, glancing at her briefly before walking toward the kitchen. His tone was as neutral as ever, but there was something different in the air, something that made Alicia's stomach tighten. As she listened to him move around the kitchen, Alicia's mind raced. Could he suspect something? Had she been too careless? Carol sat alone in his home office, the only light coming from his laptop screen. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, but sleep was the last thing on his mind. His eyes were bloodshot from hours of staring at the screen, but he couldn't stop. Not now. He scrolled through Alicia's recent bank transactions. A hotel charge here, a restaurant receipt there, all in places he had never been, on nights when Alicia had told him she was out with friends. His stomach tightened as he clicked through, each detail confirming what he already suspected but didn't want to believe. His hand hovered over the mouse, trembling slightly as he opened her messages. He got access for all without she's knowing. He hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath, but he knew he had to keep going. The messages were all there, dozens of them. Coded exchanges with a contact she had saved under an innocent name, Julie Jim. But there was no Julie, and the messages had nothing to do with workouts. He clicked on one of the threads. Can't wait to see you tonight. Same place. The reply was quick, playful. You know it. I miss you already. Carol clenched his jaw. He felt his chest tighten, and his knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of his desk. Frank, he whispered to himself, the name tasting like poison on his tongue. The man's name had shown up in some of the texts she had carelessly deleted, but Carol had already pieced together who he was. A younger man, arrogant and charming, who worked at a nearby real estate agency. Frank, the man who had been sharing his wife's bed while he, Carol, worked late into the night. He leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the screen, his mind racing. His thoughts were a jumbled mix of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. They hadn't been happy for a long time. That much he knew. But this was a different level of hurt. For months, he had been trying to figure out what had gone wrong between them. Was it his long hours at work? Had he been neglectful? He knew he hadn't been the most attentive husband lately, but this betrayal was a far cry from the usual strains of a marriage. The signs had been there. Alicia's late nights out, her sudden need for girls' weekends, and the growing emotional distance between them. He had asked her about it once, gently, almost casually, whether everything was okay. She had laughed it off, kissed him on the cheek, and told him not to worry. But something in the way she smiled, something in the way she turned away too quickly, made him feel like he was missing something. Now, sitting in the dim glow of his office, he wasn't missing anything. The truth was laid out in front of him in black and white. Alicia was cheating. He stood up from his desk and began pacing the room, his fists clenched at his sides. His normally calm demeanor was slipping. He was known for his control, his ability to keep a cool head no matter the situation. But right now, all he wanted was to break something, to scream, to confront Alicia and demand answers. He could feel the rage simmering under his skin, a pressure building in his chest that he had never felt before. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Alicia. "Hey, working late again? Just checking in. Love you." Carol stared at the message, his lip curling in disgust. The nerve of her, sending a casual "love you" after spending the night with another man. He sat down and placed the phone on the desk in front of him, just staring at it. What was he supposed to do now? Confront her? Ask for a divorce? He didn't know what would come next, but one thing was certain. He couldn't let this slide. His mind wandered back to the beginning of their marriage. He remembered how deeply in love they had been, the laughter, the plans they made, the dreams they shared. It had been perfect, or at least it had seemed so. Over time, things changed. They drifted apart in ways he couldn't explain. He worked harder, longer hours, thinking it would be enough to build a future they both wanted. But apparently, while he had been working to secure their future, she had been out securing something else. Carol turned back to his laptop and pulled up the folder he had been quietly building for weeks. Photos of Alicia with Frank, screenshots of conversations, bank statements showing the dinners and trips she had taken without him. He had known something was wrong, but now, staring at the evidence, he realized just how deep it went. She hadn't just cheated once or twice. This was a full-blown affair. The name Frank kept ringing in his head. The image of this man, this stranger who had taken what wasn't his, was etched into Carol's mind. A younger, more carefree version of the man he used to be. A thrill-seeker, someone who wasn't tied down by the burdens of a long marriage. Carol could almost picture him laughing, probably thinking he had outsmarted the husband, thinking he was getting away with it. "You think you've won, don't you?" Carol muttered under his breath. He could feel his heart pounding harder, the anger boiling up again. His whole body was tense, his mind racing with thoughts of what he should do. He wasn't just angry at Frank. He was furious at Alicia for thinking she could fool him, for thinking she could live a double life, and that he would be too oblivious to notice. But Carol wasn't oblivious. He had always been observant, always a step ahead in his business dealings and in life. He had built a successful career on being able to read people, to anticipate moves before they were made. How had he missed this? He clicked on another file and opened a picture of Alicia and Frank at a restaurant. They were laughing, her hand on his, their faces close. The sight of it made Carol's stomach turn. This was what his marriage had become. A lie. His eyes moved to the clock. It was nearly 2 a.m., and Alicia was probably asleep by now, unaware that her secret life had unraveled. Carol closed his laptop slowly and sat in the silence of the room. He wasn't ready to confront her yet. No, this needed to be handled carefully. This was more than just betrayal. It was war. And Carol was a man who knew how to win wars. He would bide his time, let Alicia continue her charade, and when the moment was right, he would strike. But for now, he would wait, and he would watch. He picked up his phone, reread Alicia's message, and replied simply, "Love you too." Then he set the phone down and smiled. It was a quiet evening when Alicia walked through the front door, keys jingling in her hand as she stepped into the hallway. The house was dark except for the soft glow coming from the living room. She slipped off her shoes, expecting the usual empty silence, but something felt off tonight. The air was thick and the atmosphere heavy. As she rounded the corner, she saw Carol sitting in the armchair, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. He wasn't watching TV or reading, just staring into the liquid as if it held the answers to something troubling. His expression was unreadable, but the coldness in his eyes immediately put her on edge. "How was your day?" Carol asked, his voice calm, but carrying an unsettling edge. Alicia froze for a moment before composing herself. She straightened her posture and stepped into the room, forcing a casual smile. "Fine," she said, keeping her voice light. "Just a regular day." "Yours?" Carol didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers, then finally set the glass down on the coffee table with a soft clink. "Interesting," he said, leaning back into the chair. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About us. About the choices we make in life." Alicia's heart skipped a beat. There was something in his tone, something dangerous lurking beneath the surface. She felt her pulse quicken, but she wasn't going to let him see her squirm. "What are you getting at, Carol?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Carol leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared at her with a cool intensity. "Do you think you're smart, Alicia?" he asked. "Do you think you can keep up this charade without consequences?" Alicia felt a rush of panic rise in her chest, but she buried it deep, maintaining her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, crossing her arms defensively. She knew exactly what he was talking about, but she wasn't going to admit anything. Not yet. Carol watched her for a moment, his eyes narrowing. Then, without warning, he stood up slowly, the movement deliberate and controlled. He walked toward her, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor, until he was standing just a few feet away. He set his empty glass on the mantel and let the silence hang between them for a moment longer before speaking. "I know everything, Alicia. About Frank. About the lies." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but the weight of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. Alicia's throat tightened, and for the first time, her mask of calm cracked slightly. "Carol," she started, but her voice faltered. He cut her off, his tone colder now. "You warned me not to mess with him, didn't you?" He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "But guess what? I did." Alicia's face drained of color. She felt her knees go weak, but she forced herself to stand her ground. "Carol, don't," she tried again, her voice pleading, but he wasn't listening. Carol took another step toward her, his eyes locked on hers, and the tension between them became unbearable. "You thought I wouldn't find out? You really thought you could play me for a fool?" His voice was louder now, the anger barely contained. "You underestimated me, Alicia, and now I'm going to show you what that costs." Alicia's mind raced. She had always thought Carol was too passive, too focused on his work to notice what was going on right under his nose. She never imagined he would dig into her life the way he had. Now, staring into his cold, furious eyes, she realized how wrong she had been. "What did you do?" Alicia asked, her voice shaking. She didn't know if she was more terrified of what he had discovered or what he was about to say next. Carol didn't answer immediately. He turned his back to her and walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet street. When he finally spoke, his voice was disturbingly calm. "I want to see him," he said, almost casually. "Frank, your little plaything." Alicia's breath caught in her throat. "You? Oh, yes," Carol continued, turning to face her again, his expression unreadable. "I had a little chat with him, and let's just say, he won't be coming around anymore." Alicia's heart pounded in her chest. She took a step forward, her voice rising with panic. "What did you do to him, Carol?" Carol smiled, but it was a cold, twisted smile that sent chills down her spine. "What I had to. He's not your problem anymore, Alicia. He's mine." "You didn't," Alicia whispered, horrified at the thought. Her mind raced with possibilities. Had Carol hurt him? Threatened him? Worse? Carol turned away again, the smile fading from his face as he picked up his glass and poured another drink. He swirled the amber liquid slowly, staring into it as if deep in thought. "It doesn't matter now. What matters is that you understand one thing." Alicia stood frozen, waiting for him to continue, her heart in her throat. Carol turned back to her, his voice deadly calm. "This little game you've been playing is over. You've made your choices, Alicia, and now you're going to live with the consequences." She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, to explain, but no words came out. The weight of his words, the finality of them, hung in the air like a death sentence. "Carol, please." "It was a mistake," he cut her off, shaking his head slowly. "No more lies, Alicia. You've said enough." He downed his drink and set the glass down on the table with a decisive thud. "I'm done." Alicia felt the ground shift beneath her. She had always thought she was in control, that she could manipulate the situation to her advantage. But now, standing in front of her husband, seeing the cold fury in his eyes, she realized that she had lost. Completely. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Carol walked past her without a word, heading toward the stairs. Before he disappeared from view, he turned back one last time, his face expressionless. "You'll find out soon enough." With that, he walked away, leaving Alicia standing alone in the darkening room, her world crashing down around her. Carol had always been a man of strategy. His business success came from meticulous planning, knowing when to strike, and most importantly, understanding his opponent. Frank was no different. To Carol, Frank wasn't just the man who had slept with his wife. He was a problem to be solved, a weakness to exploit. Carol had been patient, gathering every detail, waiting for the right moment to act. For weeks, Carol followed Frank from a distance. He learned his routine, his habits, his vulnerabilities. Frank was careless, confident in his charm and his ability to fly under the radar. He was the kind of man who thought he could get away with anything, much like Alicia had. But Carol knew better. It was a cool evening when Carol put his plan into action. Alicia had left earlier for what she thought was another discreet rendezvous. She hadn't even bothered with excuses anymore. The lies had grown lazy and transparent. Carol watched her go without a word, already knowing where she was headed. Tonight, though, he wasn't interested in her. His focus was on Frank. He waited until it was dark before slipping out of the house. The drive to Frank's apartment was quiet, the hum of the engine steady as his mind replayed every step of his plan. He parked a block away and walked the remaining distance, blending into the shadows like a predator stalking its prey. He had done his research. He knew Frank would be back soon. Carol positioned himself near the entrance of the apartment complex, concealed by a row of cars. He watched the minutes tick by, his pulse steady, his mind sharp. This wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about precision. Revenge was best served cold, after all. Finally, the sound of an approaching car broke the silence. Carol shifted slightly, staying hidden as the vehicle pulled into a parking spot. The driver's door opened, and Frank stepped out, his casual swagger immediately grating on Carol's nerves. Frank was oblivious, not a care in the world, as he fished his keys from his pocket and headed toward his door. "You must be Frank," Carol said, his voice calm, chillingly composed. Frank froze, his hand halfway to the lock. He turned slowly, his face a mixture of confusion and annoyance. He hadn't even registered the danger yet. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place the stranger standing just outside the shadows. Carol took a slow step forward, his eyes locked on Frank's. "I'm Alicia's husband." The words were simple, but the weight behind them hit Frank like a freight train. Frank's face paled, and for a moment, he stood there, frozen, as the realization dawned. His mouth opened to say something, maybe to explain, maybe to lie, but the words never came. Instead, his hand instinctively reached for his phone, fumbling in his pocket. Carol saw the move coming, but he didn't flinch. He had expected it. Before Frank could react, Carol closed the distance between them in 2 quick strides, his hand lashing out to knock the phone to the ground. It clattered on the pavement, the screen cracking as it skidded away. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Carol said, his voice low but filled with a quiet menace. "Sneaking around with my wife, thinking I wouldn't find out." Frank tried to step back, but Carol was already on him. In one fluid motion, he shoved Frank hard against the wall, pinning him with an iron grip on his collar. Frank's breath came in short, panicked gasps, his eyes wide with fear. "Look, man, I didn't know," Frank stammered, his voice shaking. "Don't lie to me," Carol growled, tightening his grip. "I've seen the texts, the emails. I know everything." Frank's eyes darted around, looking for an escape, but there was none. Carol's calm demeanor only made the situation more terrifying. This wasn't a man who had lost control. This was a man who had planned every second of this moment. "You thought you could just walk away, didn't you?" Carol continued, his face inches from Frank's. "You thought there wouldn't be consequences." Frank struggled against Carol's grip, his voice cracking as he tried to reason with him. "Look, I'm sorry, okay? I didn't mean for things to go this far." Carol smirked, his eyes cold and calculating. "It's too late for that." Without warning, Carol released his grip on Frank's collar. But before Frank could react, Carol swung his fist hard into Frank's stomach. The blow knocked the wind out of him, and Frank doubled over, gasping for air. Carroll didn't stop. He grabbed Frank by the back of his neck and slammed him against the wall again, this time harder. Frank groaned in pain, his hands coming up to try to push Carroll away, but it was useless. Carroll was in complete control, his movements swift and brutal. Another punch landed, this time to Frank's face, sending him sprawling to the ground. "You took everything from me," Carroll hissed, standing over him. "You thought you could get away with it, that you could walk away unscathed. But now you're going to learn what it feels like to have your life ripped apart." Frank was on his hands and knees, blood dripping from his nose, coughing and wheezing. He tried to crawl away, but Carroll grabbed him by the shirt and hauled him up, throwing him into the wall again. "Please," Frank gasped, his voice barely a whisper. You didn't think," Carroll finished for him, his voice cold and steady. "You didn't think I'd find out. You didn't think I'd come for you. But here we are." Frank slumped against the wall, his body limp and broken, his face a mess of blood and bruises. He no longer had the strength to fight back, his eyes dazed as he looked up at Carroll in terror. Carroll crouched down beside him, his face calm, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're going to leave town. Tonight. If I ever see you again." He let the threat hang in the air, knowing Frank understood exactly what he meant. Frank nodded weakly, his breath ragged, his body shaking. Carroll stood up, dusting off his hands as if the whole ordeal had been nothing more than a mild inconvenience. He glanced down at Frank one last time, his expression unreadable. "Consider this a warning," Carroll said quietly. "Next time, I won't be so generous." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Frank lying in the dark, broken and defeated. It was past midnight when Alicia's phone buzzed on the nightstand. She stirred, half asleep, and reached out for it lazily. Expecting Frank's usual message to tell her he'd made it home, she didn't bother checking the caller ID. "Hello," she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. There was a pause, then a calm but serious voice responded on the other end. "Mrs. Williams?" Alicia's eyes shot open at the tone. She sat up, her mind racing. "Yes, this is Alicia," she said, now wide awake. "This is the Mount Sinai Hospital," the voice continued. "We need you to come down to the emergency room immediately. There's been an incident." Alicia's heart leapt into her throat. "Is it Carroll?" she blurted out. The flicker of hope she had been harboring for months sparked momentarily. Maybe he'd been in an accident. Maybe the situation with Frank had pushed him to do something reckless, something that would finally free her from this marriage. There was a brief pause on the other end before the voice replied. "No, it's Frank. He's been badly hurt. You need to come right away." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "Frank," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. She swallowed, the taste of bile rising in her throat. "What happened?" The voice on the other end remained professional, but Alicia could hear the underlying tension. "He sustained severe injuries, Mrs. Williams. The doctors are doing what they can. Please come as soon as possible." Her mind reeled. What had happened? Had Carroll found him? The thought was too terrifying to fully process. Without thinking, she threw the covers off and scrambled to get dressed, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the buttons of her shirt. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Alicia barely remembered getting into the car or speeding through the quiet streets. All she could think about was Frank, his face, his smile, the way he had made her feel alive again. And now he was lying in a hospital bed, hurt. Badly hurt, the voice had said. By the time she pulled into the hospital parking lot, her mind was spinning with questions and dread. She rushed through the entrance, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she made her way to the front desk. "I'm here for Frank. Frank," she stammered, struggling to recall his last name in the moment of panic. The nurse at the desk nodded, her expression grim. "He's in room 316, third floor. The doctors are still with him, but you can go in." Alicia didn't wait for more. She rushed toward the elevator, the sterile smell of the hospital filling her lungs as her heart pounded in her chest. When she reached Frank's room, she hesitated for a second outside the door, her hand hovering over the handle. She took a deep breath and pushed it open. The sight that greeted her on the other side was worse than anything she could have imagined. Frank lay on the hospital bed, his face barely recognizable beneath the bandages and bruises. Tubes and machines surrounded him, beeping and hissing softly, keeping him alive. His eyes were swollen shut, and blood stained the gauze wrapped around his head. His once strong, confident body was now broken, lying motionless under the thin hospital sheets. Alicia's stomach churned, and she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She stumbled toward the chair by his bed, her knees weak. She stared at him, her mind struggling to accept the reality of what she was seeing. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What did they do to you?" Frank didn't respond. He was too far gone, lost in whatever pain or drugs were keeping him sedated. Alicia's eyes filled with tears as she reached out and gently touched his hand. It was cold, limp in her grasp. The door creaked open, and a doctor entered, glancing at her briefly before checking Frank's chart. He had the tired look of someone who had seen too many tragedies unfold in this very room. "Mrs. Williams?" he asked softly. Alicia nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The doctor sighed, closing the chart and looking at her with a mixture of pity and professionalism. "He's stable for now, but his injuries are severe. Broken ribs, a fractured skull, internal bleeding. We're doing everything we can, but it's going to be a long road to recovery. If he pulls through." Alicia felt like the room was spinning. She had expected Carol to be angry, to confront Frank, maybe even fight him. But this was beyond anything she had imagined. Who did this?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. The doctor gave her a sympathetic look. "The police are investigating, but it looks like he was attacked brutally. We'll know more when he wakes up, if he can tell us anything." Alicia nodded numbly, her mind barely registering the words. She sat in silence for what felt like hours, staring at Frank's broken body, her thoughts consumed by guilt and fear. Finally, she stood, her legs weak, and made her way out of the hospital. The night air was cold against her skin as she got into her car, but she barely noticed. Her mind was racing, trying to piece together what had happened. Carol had found him. He had to have. But how? And what had he done? When she arrived home, the house was eerily silent. She dropped her keys on the counter and made her way to the kitchen, her thoughts a blur. That's when she saw it. A single piece of paper lying on the kitchen table. Her breath caught in her throat as she walked over to it, her hands shaking as she picked it up. The note was short, scrawled in Carol familiar handwriting. "Bitch, look what I'm going to do to you." Alicia's legs gave out, and she collapsed into the chair, the note trembling in her hands. Carol was gone. His side of the closet hung empty, the once neat row of shoes missing. The dresser drawers that had held his clothes were bare, and even the scent of his cologne had faded from the air. The joint bank accounts were cleaned out. Every valuable piece of jewelry Alicia owned was gone, and any sign of Carol had vanished as though he had never existed. Only the note remained, its venomous words replaying in Alicia's mind every time she closed her eyes. She sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the now useless checkbook in her hands. She had made calls to the bank, tried to trace the withdrawals, but Carol had covered his tracks too well. He wasn't coming back. There was no money left, no savings, and no way to fix the mess her life had become. The house, once a cozy home filled with laughter, felt cold and empty, echoing her own isolation. Days blurred into one another as Alicia tried to make sense of the wreckage. She barely left the house, ignoring calls from friends and family. Katie had stopped by a few times, worried, but Alicia couldn't bear to face her. It was as if everything she had built, everything she had been, had crumbled in her hands. On the rare occasions when Alicia did leave, it was to visit Frank in the hospital, but even that had become an unbearable task. His condition had stabilized, but the damage was done. He would never be the same. The man who had once brought her excitement and passion now lay in a hospital bed, broken both physically and emotionally. One afternoon, Alicia stood outside Frank's room, hesitating. She hadn't seen him since the night Carol had attacked him. She could still remember the nurse's voice when she had asked about Frank's condition. He was recovering, they had said, but slowly. His injuries were severe, and the road ahead would be long and painful. She gathered her breath and knocked softly on the door, hoping he might be willing to see her. Frank's eyes flicked up at her from the bed, cold and distant. "What do you want?" His voice was rough, a shadow of the man she had once known. Alicia took a step forward, unsure of what to say. "Frank, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." He laughed bitterly, though it turned into a grimace of pain. "You didn't mean for this? What did you think would happen, Alicia? You played with fire, and now we're both burned." Her eyes welled up with tears, but she forced them back. "I didn't know Carol would do this. I didn't think he was capable." "Stop," Frank cut her off, his tone sharp. "I don't want your apologies. I don't want your pity. I've lost everything because of you. My job, my reputation, my future. You think sorry is enough?" His words were venomous, each one laced with anger and bitterness. Alicia stepped back, feeling the weight of his resentment. "Frank, get out." His voice was final. His eyes locked on hers with an intensity that left no room for argument. "I don't want to see you again, Alicia. We're done." She stood frozen for a moment, the words sinking in. Finally, with nothing left to say, she turned and walked out of the room. The door clicked softly behind her, but the sound echoed loudly in her chest. It was over. Frank was gone, just like Carol. And now, she was truly alone. Meanwhile, in a new city hundreds of miles away, Carol thrived. He had taken everything, her money, her jewelry, and any shred of dignity she had left, and built a new life for himself. The man who had once been consumed by the quiet, methodical grind of his marriage had shed that skin, reinventing himself with the money he'd stolen. He was no longer the quiet husband who stayed late at the office, oblivious to the world around him. Now he was free. Carol had moved into a modest but comfortable apartment. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention, just enough to start fresh. He had no need for extravagant displays of wealth. All he wanted was the peace that came from knowing he had won. He kept to himself, blending into his new surroundings, never making a scene. He found work easily, nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills. And most importantly, it kept him off the radar. Every so often, when he felt the need to twist the knife just a little more, Carol would send Alicia a reminder of what he had done. A postcard from some random city, a cryptic message sent from a disposable phone. The first one had arrived only a few weeks after he disappeared. A simple postcard, no return address, just 3 words written on the back in his familiar handwriting. "Miss me yet?" Alicia had nearly thrown it across the room in anger when she first saw it. But she knew there was nothing she could do. Carol was out there somewhere, living his life, and she was stuck here, trapped in the ruins of her choices. The postcards continued to arrive sporadically, each one more mocking than the last. Sometimes they were blank, with nothing but a smudge of ink on the corner. Other times they carried cryptic messages, "How's Frank?" or "Thinking of you," each one designed to unsettle her, to remind her that he was out there, watching, and there was nothing she could do about it. Weeks turned into months. Alicia's life became a monotonous cycle of regret and isolation. She had tried to go back to work, but the whispers followed her everywhere. People knew. They knew about the affair, they knew about Frank, and they knew about Carol's sudden disappearance. She could feel their judgment in every glance, every hushed conversation that stopped when she walked into the room. There was no escaping the consequences of her choices. Her friends had distanced themselves, her family barely spoke to her, and Frank had made it clear that he never wanted to see her again. She was alone, haunted by the ghost of a marriage that had been over long before Carol had vanished. And yet, despite everything, despite the postcards and the guilt and the loneliness, a part of her still held on to the hope that maybe, one day, Carol would come back. But deep down, she knew the truth. Carol had won. It was a dreary afternoon when Alicia heard the knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. Most of her friends had drifted away, and she had cut herself off from the rest. When she opened the door, she found a man standing there in a suit, holding a thick envelope. "Alicia Williams?" he asked, looking at her with a businesslike detachment. She nodded cautiously. "Yes, that's me." Without another word, the man handed her the envelope and walked away. Confused, Alicia stepped back inside and tore it open, her hands trembling as she read the heading, "Petition for Divorce." Her heart sank. She knew it was coming. Carol had left her months ago, stripped her of everything, and disappeared. But seeing it in writing, the finality of it, hit her in a way she wasn't prepared for. She slumped into the nearest chair, staring blankly at the papers. There was no money left to fight it. No lawyers she could afford to help her contest anything. And even if there was, what could she contest? She had nothing. The house was in foreclosure, her savings drained. She was drowning in debt, bills she had ignored in the hope that maybe, somehow, things would get better. But they hadn't. And now, Carol was severing the last tie that connected them. Days passed in a fog as Alicia shuffled through what remained of her life. She tried to focus on the mundane tasks, making coffee, cleaning up, flipping through job listings, but none of it mattered. She was a shell, empty inside, moving through her days without purpose. The affair that had once felt so exhilarating now seemed like a cruel joke. Frank was gone, Carol was gone, and her life had fallen apart. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the divorce papers for what felt like the 100th time, her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, but something made her answer. "Hello," she said, her voice flat. "Alicia." The voice on the other end was unmistakable. Carol. Her grip tightened on the phone. "Carol," she said, her heart racing. "What do you want?" There was a long pause before he answered. "Just wanted to make sure you got the papers." Alicia swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I got them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is this really what you want?" Carol chuckled softly. "It's done, Alicia. You're lucky I'm even giving you this courtesy. After everything you did, you're lucky I don't leave you with less." His words stung, but Alicia knew better than to argue. She had no power here. Carol had already taken everything from her: her money, her home, her dignity. All that was left was a hollow sense of guilt and regret. "Why?" she asked after a moment, her voice shaky. "Why do this? You've already destroyed everything. Why drag it out?" There was another pause. Then Carol spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "Because I want you to remember. I want you to wake up every morning and know that this is your fault. You made your choice, and now you're paying for it." Alicia felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You didn't have to ruin my life." Carol laughed again, but this time it was darker, colder. "You ruined it yourself the moment you thought you could betray me. The divorce is just the final touch. Now you're free. Isn't that what you wanted?" She sat there in silence, unable to respond. He was right in a way. She had wanted out. She had wanted excitement, passion, something to fill the void that had grown between them over the years. But now, all that was left was the crushing realization that she had traded everything for nothing. "Goodbye, Alicia," Carol said finally, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Enjoy your freedom." And then he hung up. Months passed, and the divorce was finalized without a fight. Alicia signed the papers, watching as the last remnants of her marriage slipped away. She was officially free, but it didn't feel like it. The weight of Carol revenge hung over her like a dark cloud, suffocating her every day. Frank never contacted her. The hospital had discharged him long ago, but he had disappeared from her life completely. Word had gotten out about the affair, and any hope of reconciliation was dead. Frank's life had been shattered as much as hers, and he had no intention of picking up the pieces with her. Carol, on the other hand, had moved on. He had built a new life for himself, far away from the chaos he had left behind. He no longer thought about Alicia, except in those moments when he sent her a postcard or a message just to remind her that he hadn't forgotten. The ultimate revenge wasn't just the financial ruin, the destruction of her reputation, or the divorce. It was the knowledge that she would never escape what she had done, that she would live in the shadow of her choices forever. Every time she looked in the mirror, she would see the woman who had lost everything for a fleeting affair, a woman whose life was now defined by regret and loss. Carol was free. He had his revenge. And Alicia? She would never be free of him.